Imagine being so cold that your fingers turn black and fall off while you're still alive. Imagine not seeing sunlight for weeks. Imagine hearing explosions so loud that they rupture your internal organs, even if the shrapnel never touches you. This wasn't some nightmare. This was Tuesday morning in the First World War. For nearly 4 years, millions of young men found themselves living in conditions so horrific, so impossibly brutal, that the human mind can barely comprehend it even today. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were prisoners. Prisoners of mud, rats, disease, and an enemy they could barely see. But somehow they survived. Not all of them, but enough to tell stories that have been buried in history books and forgotten archives for over a century. And today, we're bringing those stories back to life. The Western Front. Even the name sounds ominous. A scar across the face of France and Belgium that stretched from the English Channel all the way to the Swiss border. Over 400 miles of trenches. Think about that. 400 miles. Not of roads, not of rivers, of trenches, of homes carved into the earth, where human beings existed in conditions we can barely fathom today. When you think of soldiers living in trenches, your mind probably goes to some vague image of mud and danger. But the reality was infinitely more complex, infinitely more terrifying, and infinitely more interesting than you probably imagine. These weren't just military installations. These were underground cities, entire civilizations of human suffering and extraordinary survival. And the soldiers who lived there, they became something the military had never seen before. They became trenched soldiers, a new breed of warrior shaped entirely by the environment that surrounded them. On the 28th of June, 1914, a young Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip fired 2 shots in Sarajevo. Those shots killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and his wife Sophie. Those 2 shots would eventually lead to the deaths of over 20 million people. But in the beginning, nobody knew that. Nobody could have known that those moments would spiral into a 4-year nightmare that would change the entire course of human history. When the war started, everyone thought it would be over by Christmas. German generals called it a war that would last just a few months. French generals had battle plans that assumed rapid movement and decisive victory. British generals recruited volunteers by the millions, confident that the war would be quick, clean, and ultimately victorious. All of them were catastrophically wrong. The reality of modern warfare was something the military establishment simply wasn't prepared for. When soldiers faced each other in open battle with rifles and artillery, something unexpected happened. Machine guns happened. A single machine gun could fire 700 bullets per minute. 700. Try to picture that. Not shots, bullets. Individual pieces of metal traveling at speeds that made them invisible to the naked eye. And they were everywhere. On September 6, 1914, the First Battle of the Marne changed everything. French and British forces collided with the advancing German armies in a battle that was supposed to be a glorious military victory. Instead, it became a slaughterhouse. Over 200,000 casualties in a single engagement. And neither side won. Neither side lost. They just stopped. Both armies dug in. They created defensive positions. They built trenches. And those trenches became permanent. A stalemate. A deadlock that nobody knew how to break. It began with simple ditches. Soldiers would scrape out shallow trenches to protect themselves from machine gun fire. But as weeks turned into months, those simple ditches transformed into elaborate defensive systems. Multiple lines of trenches, each one deeper than the last. Barbed wire barriers that stretched for miles. Communication trenches that connected different sections like the veins of some massive underground organism. Underground bunkers and shelters. Poison gas detection systems. Supply lines that moved like arteries, pumping food, ammunition, and reinforcements to keep the system functioning. A typical sector of the front might contain 3 lines of trenches. The front line was where soldiers actually faced the enemy, just yards away, sometimes only 50 meters from the German positions. The support trench was the second line, positioned about 200 yards back, and the reserve trench was the third line, where soldiers could rest and prepare for counterattacks. Each trench was connected by narrow communication trenches that twisted and turned to avoid direct fire. The front-line trench wasn't a continuous line either. It was broken into defensive positions called bays. Each bay held roughly a squad of men, around 10 soldiers. This way, if one position was captured, it didn't mean the entire line was compromised. There were fire steps that soldiers stood on to see over the top and fire their rifles. There were sniping positions with special periscopes that let shooters fire without exposing their heads. There were observation posts hidden in no man's land, where soldiers could watch the enemy movements and report back. No man's land was the nightmare space between the opposing trenches, a barren wasteland of mud, barbed wire and death. It was anywhere from 50 meters to several miles wide, depending on the sector. During the day, nothing moved in no man's land if it could help it. Any movement meant instant death from 1,000 sniper rifles and machine guns. At night, raiding parties would venture out, crawling through the darkness, sometimes conducting reconnaissance, sometimes trying to capture enemy prisoners. But the trenches themselves were the real prison, and living inside them became a challenge, unlike anything soldiers had experienced before. The first and most obvious problem was water. The ground in many sectors of the Western Front sat on top of ancient underground springs. When soldiers dug down, they were literally digging down toward water. During heavy rains, trenches would flood. Some soldiers reported standing in water that was several feet deep. Their feet would become waterlogged and infected. The condition was called trench foot, and it was one of the most common causes of hospitalization in the First World War. Trench foot happened when soldiers stood in cold, wet conditions for extended periods without proper drainage. The skin would become numb and blistered. Blood vessels would constrict. The tissue would begin to die while the soldier was still walking around. In severe cases, gangrene would set in. The flesh would literally rot. Soldiers who survived trench foot often had their toes and parts of their feet amputated. Some soldiers lost entire feet, all from standing in a trench. To combat this, soldiers were issued special powder to keep their feet dry. They were supposed to change their socks regularly. But in the chaos of trench warfare, these simple precautions were often forgotten or impossible to implement. A soldier might be scheduled to rotate out of the trenches in 3 days, which was just enough time for trench foot to develop in this cold, wet environment. So soldiers developed a gruesome habit. They would perform what was called a prophylactic inspection, running their fingers across their feet, checking for the telltale numbness and discoloration that signaled the beginning of infection. If they found it, they would report to the medical officer and hope to get evacuated before the damage became permanent. Then there were the rats. The rats of the Western Front were unlike anything soldiers had ever encountered. They grew to enormous sizes, some reaching the weight of a small cat. They were attracted to the smell of food, of blood, of decaying bodies. They populated the trenches by the millions. Soldiers reported finding them in their food rations. They would crawl across sleeping soldiers at night. There are accounts of rats actually attacking wounded men who were lying helpless in the trenches, biting and gnawing on their wounds. The rat problem was so severe that the military actually developed specific protocols to deal with it. Soldiers were given traps and poison. Some units assigned specific soldiers to be rat hunters, whose job was literally to hunt and kill rats inside the trenches. But it was like trying to bail out the ocean with a teaspoon. The rats kept coming. They thrived in the trenches. They fed on the endless supply of food scraps, corpses, and biological waste that accumulated in those underground chambers. Beyond the physical challenges, there was the psychological weight of trench warfare. Soldiers would spend anywhere from 3 days to 2 weeks in the frontline trenches, depending on the military unit and the situation. 3 days doesn't sound like much until you understand what those 3 days meant. 3 days without leaving the trench. 3 days of constant vigilance. 3 days of knowing that at any moment, an order could come down to go over the top and assault the enemy positions. Going over the top was the nightmare that haunted every soldier in the trenches. It's the image we all have in our minds when we think of the First World War. Soldiers climbing out of the trenches and running toward the enemy lines while machine guns and artillery tore through their ranks. It was humanity's most organized form of suicide. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of men would be ordered to attack fortified positions. The survival rate was somewhere between abysmal and non-existent. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, July 1st, 1916, over 19,000 British soldiers died. 19,000 in a single day. That's not counting the wounded, who numbered over 35,000. In total, over 60,000 British casualties on the first day of a single battle. It remains the deadliest day in British military history, and this was just day one. The battle would continue for months, eventually resulting in nearly 1 million casualties with no meaningful strategic victory for either side. The statistics are so staggering that they lose all meaning. You can read that 990,000 men were wounded or killed at the Somme, and your brain just kind of shuts down. You can't process that. The number is too large. So, let's try something different. Let's talk about what that meant for the soldiers actually living it. A young man named William Smallwood joined the British Army in 1914. He was 19 years old, eager to serve his country, excited about the adventure of war. He had no idea what he was walking into. Within 3 months, he was standing in a trench at the Somme, waiting for the order to go over the top. He watched as the whistles blew. He watched as thousands of soldiers around him began to climb out of the trenches. He watched as they started running forward through no man's land. And then he watched as the machine guns started firing. In his diary, which was discovered nearly a century later, Smallwood wrote about the moment in excruciating detail. He described the sound of the bullets, which he said was like 1,000 angry wasps. He described the way men would suddenly drop, as if their legs had simply stopped working. He described the screaming, not battle screams, not war cries, screams of agony from men who had been torn apart by machine gun fire, but were still alive, still conscious, desperately trying to crawl back to the trench. Smallwood made it through that day. He was wounded in the leg, but was able to crawl back to the trench. He survived the immediate aftermath, but in his diary entries from the weeks that followed, you can see his psychological state deteriorating. He writes about not being able to sleep. He writes about jumping at loud noises. He writes about the smell that he couldn't escape. The smell of death and human waste and mud that seemed to have soaked into every fiber of his being. This was what soldiers dealt with on a daily basis. This was the reality of trench warfare. It wasn't glorious. It wasn't heroic in the way that wars are typically portrayed. It was brutal, dehumanizing, and traumatizing, and soldiers had to find ways to survive it psychologically, as much as physically. The military establishment didn't really understand this at the time. Psychological trauma was classified as something called shell shock, and the response to it was often brutal. Soldiers who showed signs of psychological distress would sometimes be executed by their own side. The military feared that allowing soldiers to retreat due to psychological reasons would create a wave of desertion. So instead, they tried to force soldiers to continue fighting, often with fatal consequences. In the British Army alone, over 300 soldiers were court-martialed and executed for military offences during the First World War. Many of them were clearly suffering from severe psychological trauma. They were shot by firing squads made up of their own comrades. The trauma of watching a friend be executed for showing signs of shell shock was, obviously, not therapeutic for the soldiers who witnessed it. This meant that soldiers had to develop coping mechanisms on their own. They had to find ways to survive psychologically inside an environment that was designed to break the human mind. And they did. In ways that were often surprising and sometimes darkly funny, soldiers found humor and humanity in the trenches. Soldiers would develop elaborate jokes and rituals. They would name their trenches with affectionate nicknames, turning the deadly defensive positions into something almost familiar. They would create makeshift entertainment in the form of trench newspapers that were hand-drawn and distributed among the soldiers. These newspapers would contain jokes, cartoons, stories, and commentary on life in the trenches. Some of them were actually quite good. Some of them are still preserved in museums today, and reading them, you can see soldiers using humor as a weapon against despair. Songs were another crucial survival tool. Soldiers would sing in the trenches, creating a kind of vocal wall against the silence and the darkness. There were traditional military marching songs, but there were also new songs created specifically to reflect the reality of trench warfare. Some of these songs were bawdy and crude. Some were surprisingly poignant. All of them served the same purpose. They kept soldiers' spirits up and reminded them that they were still human beings capable of joy and laughter despite living in literal hell. The food in the trenches was another constant challenge. Soldiers' rations consisted primarily of something called bully beef, which was canned corned beef that had been made decades before and seemed to get worse with age. They also received hardtack biscuits that were so hard they could literally break teeth. There was jam, which was usually the only thing that tasted like anything other than despair. There was bread when the supply lines worked properly, which was not often. And there was rum. Lots of rum. The British military used alcohol as a tool to keep soldiers fighting. Before major attacks, soldiers would be given rations of rum to build up their courage. This often resulted in soldiers being sent into battle drunk, which actually worked sometimes, because apparently it's harder to be afraid when you're intoxicated. But it also meant that soldiers were often trying to digest food and process alcohol while being systematically traumatized by warfare. The combination couldn't have been great for their digestive systems or their long-term psychological health. Food procurement became a kind of creative endeavor in the trenches. Soldiers would forage for anything edible. They would catch rats and cook them, despite the fact that the same rats were probably eating corpses just yards away. They would trade with soldiers from other units for better food. Some enterprising soldiers would even attempt to grow vegetables in small plots near the trenches, though the soil was so polluted with chemicals and decay that the vegetables were probably not much better than the bully beef. Water was another constant concern. Soldiers needed water to drink, to cook, to wash, to clean their wounds. But getting clean water to the front lines was a logistical nightmare. Many soldiers drank from shell craters that were essentially open sewers, contaminated with human waste, dead bodies, and chemical residue. This led to widespread disease. Dysentery was common. Typhoid fever spread through the ranks. Soldiers were dying from diseases almost as often as they were dying from combat. Medical care in the trenches was limited at best and horrifying at worst. There were medical posts set up behind the lines, but getting a wounded soldier there was incredibly difficult. You had to extract him from the trench, get him across no man's land if possible, and transport him to the rear. This journey could take hours. During this time, wounds that could have been treated would become infected. Soldiers who might have survived with immediate medical attention would die from loss of blood or shock. The field hospitals were nightmares of their own. Surgeons were working with primitive anesthetics and basic surgical instruments, trying to save men who had been blown apart by artillery shells. Amputation was often the only option. A soldier might come into a field hospital with a mangled leg and leave it without. The psychological trauma of suddenly losing a limb was compounded by the fact that the soldier would then have to figure out how to survive in a trench, or more likely, how to be transported to a proper hospital, which might be weeks or months away. Infection was another massive killer. Gangrene would set in. Tetanus would claim soldiers who had minor wounds that seemed survivable. Sepsis would develop from puncture wounds that got contaminated. With all the toxic materials embedded in the soil of the Western Front, a minor scratch could become a death sentence within days. Despite all of this, soldiers survived. They survived not just physically but psychologically. They survived by creating community, by finding meaning in their suffering, by developing bonds with their comrades that were so intense that they make modern friendships look superficial. These weren't just fellow soldiers. These were brothers, men who depended on each other for survival every single second of every single day. The relationships formed in the trenches were unlike anything in peacetime. Soldiers would share the same space for weeks at a time. They would huddle together for warmth. They would comfort each other when wounds were being dressed. They would hold each other when death seemed imminent. These bonds created a kind of collective psychological survival mechanism. No one was going to fall apart because their comrades needed them to be strong. No one was going to give up because the men around them were depending on them. There are letters from soldiers that talk about the moment they realized they might actually make it through the war. For some, it was after surviving a particular brutal battle. For others, it was a random moment of beauty in the trenches. A soldier named Robert Graves wrote about looking at the sky at dawn and realizing that despite the horror, despite the death, despite the impossibility of the situation, there was still something beautiful about existence. Just the fact of being alive was, in its own way, a victory. One of the most fascinating aspects of survival in the trenches was how soldiers adapted their bodies and minds to the environment. The human body is incredibly adaptable, and soldiers developed physiological responses to trench warfare that probably wouldn't be possible in normal circumstances. They developed an ability to sleep standing up in short bursts while remaining aware of their surroundings. They developed an almost superhuman ability to eat whatever food they were given without complaint. They developed calluses and toughness that made their pre-war selves seem soft and naive. But perhaps most interestingly, they developed a kind of psychological numbness to violence and death. This wasn't a good thing exactly. It was a survival mechanism. After weeks of being exposed to death and destruction, the human mind essentially puts a kind of filter on emotions. A soldier would see a comrade killed in the morning and by the afternoon they would be joking about it. Not because they didn't care, but because the alternative, feeling the full weight of that loss, would be psychologically catastrophic. There are accounts from soldiers that describe this numbness in almost clinical detail. They would see a body that had been partially torn apart by artillery fire, and instead of being horrified, they would be curious about the mechanical aspects of it. How did the human body break? What happened to the internal organs? It's the kind of detachment that allowed people to function in an environment that was fundamentally inhuman. Part of the survival process was also the development of routine. In an environment where death could come at any moment, routine created a semblance of normalcy. A typical day in the trenches would start before dawn. Soldiers would stand on the fire steps, weapons at the ready, watching for signs of an enemy attack. This was called stand-to, and it would last for perhaps an hour until the sun rose and it became clear that the night had passed without an assault. Then there would be breakfast, usually some bread and maybe some cheese. Then there was work. The trenches required constant maintenance. The walls would collapse, the drainage systems would get clogged, the barbed wire needed repair, so soldiers would spend hours doing manual labor, reinforcing the trenches, digging new positions, clearing sludge from the communication trenches. This work was dangerous in its own way. Snipers would sometimes target work parties, and a soldier could be shot while simply trying to repair a trench wall. But the work had to be done, because the alternative was to let the trenches fall apart and lose the defensive positions entirely. As the day wore on, there might be maintenance on weapons. Rifles had to be cleaned and checked. Machine guns had to be serviced. Artillery positions had to be verified and adjusted. Letters had to be written, though getting mail in and out of the trenches was unreliable at best. Soldiers would spend hours writing letters to their families, trying to describe their experiences in ways that wouldn't cause panic or despair on the home front. The censors would read these letters, removing any information about troop movements or battle plans, but also sometimes removing anything too honest about the conditions in the trenches. As evening approached, soldiers would be issued their rations, and they would eat whatever was available. Then, as darkness fell, there might be a night raid. Raiding parties would prepare, blackening their faces, checking their weapons, preparing for the journey into no man's land. Or there might be simple vigilance, standing watch, looking out into the darkness for any sign of movement. And then, eventually, soldiers would try to sleep, finding whatever shelter they could in the narrow confines of the trench, always aware that they might be awakened at any moment by an artillery barrage or an alarm signaling an enemy attack. This routine, played out day after day, month after month, allowed soldiers to survive. It gave them something to focus on beyond the abstract horror of their situation. It created a structure that the human mind could grasp and process. And in that structure, surrounded by comrades who were experiencing the same thing, soldiers found the psychological resources to keep living, keep fighting, and keep hoping for a future beyond the trenches. Some soldiers developed what might be called an addiction to danger. After weeks or months in the trenches, the constant low-level threat of death actually became the norm. The psychology of the situation was so twisted that soldiers would sometimes be more anxious about going on leave, about being away from their units, than they were about being in the trenches. The trenches had become their home, their identity, their entire world. Leaving that world, even temporarily, created an anxiety that manifested as a kind of homesickness for danger. There are documented cases of soldiers actually volunteering for dangerous missions, for raiding parties, for positions that had a high likelihood of resulting in death or serious injury. Psychologically, this is fascinating. These men had survived this long precisely because they were good at avoiding unnecessary risk. But after enough time in the trenches, the mind starts to crave the intensity of danger in the same way it craves food or water. Some soldiers seemed to actually miss combat when they were out of it. The depression and anxiety they experienced on leave was sometimes worse than the fear they experienced in the trenches. This was part of what made the transition to peace so difficult for many First World War veterans. When the armistice finally came in November 1918, after 4 years of slaughter, soldiers were suddenly expected to simply go back to normal life, to take off their uniforms, go back to their jobs or find new ones, resume dating and marriage and all the normal civilian activities that had been put on hold. But for many soldiers, normal life seemed impossible. They had been shaped by the trenches. The trenches had become part of their identity in a way that was almost inseparable from who they were as human beings. Many veterans spent the rest of their lives trying to explain what it had been like. They wrote books, gave lectures, created art, all in an attempt to convey to people who hadn't been there what the trench experience had actually meant. Some of them became activists, working to prevent future wars. Others became increasingly isolated, unable to bridge the gap between their trench experiences and civilian life. Some turned to alcohol or drugs. Some took their own lives. The war didn't end when the armistice was signed. For many veterans, it continued for the rest of their lives. But there were also soldiers who found meaning in their survival, who came to believe that they had survived the trenches for a reason, that their survival meant something, that the comrades who had died deserved to be remembered. These veterans became historians, documenting their experiences, creating oral histories that preserved the truth of what trench warfare had actually been like. Without these veterans and their willingness to share their stories, we would have no idea what daily life in the trenches was actually like. The science of survival in the trenches is interesting from a physiological perspective as well. Humans are incredibly adaptable creatures, and soldiers in the trenches underwent physical transformations that allowed them to cope with conditions that would normally be lethal. Their immune systems had to become stronger to resist the constant bombardment of disease and infection. Their cardiovascular systems had to adapt to chronic stress. Their sleep patterns fundamentally altered. They developed new baseline levels for what constituted acceptable living conditions. This adaptation had consequences that lasted long after the war ended. Many First World War veterans lived with chronic health problems for the rest of their lives. Their immune systems had been damaged by the constant stress and disease exposure. Their nervous systems remained in a kind of heightened state of alert. They were prone to infections that otherwise healthy people would have easily fought off. Their life expectancy was lower than their civilian counterparts who hadn't experienced trench warfare. The trenches had literally changed their bodies at a cellular level in ways that took decades to fully manifest. The psychological scars were similarly long-lasting and profound. The diagnosis of shell shock, later refined to what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, became recognized as a real medical condition, partly because of the sheer number of First World War veterans who were suffering from it. Soldiers were having nightmares decades after the war ended. They were having panic attacks triggered by loud noises. They were having flashbacks to specific moments in the trenches that would suddenly overwhelm them. They were struggling with depression and anxiety in ways that contemporary medicine barely understood, let alone knew how to treat. What's remarkable is that despite all of this, soldiers found ways to maintain their humanity in the trenches. They didn't become monsters or machines. They remained capable of compassion, humor, and hope, even in the most dehumanizing circumstances imaginable. There are countless stories of soldiers performing acts of kindness and bravery for their comrades, of soldiers risking their lives to help wounded men, of soldiers creating moments of beauty and joy in the midst of horror. One particularly moving account comes from a British soldier named Siegfried Sassoon, who was not only a soldier but also a poet. Sassoon survived the trenches with wounds both physical and psychological, and he spent the rest of his life writing about his experiences. In his poetry, he captured something essential about the trench experience that statistics and military reports could never convey. He wrote about the sensory experiences, the smells, the sounds, the feelings. He wrote about the absurdity of war and the way that military commanders seemed completely divorced from the reality of what soldiers were actually experiencing. One of his most famous poems talks about soldiers returning from the trenches. Sassoon writes about how they march through the streets of their hometowns and the people cheer for them, completely unaware of what these men have experienced. The civilians see glorious soldiers returning from defending their nation. What they actually see are traumatized men who have been fundamentally altered by an experience that civilians can barely comprehend. The disconnect between the civilian perception of war and the actual reality of trench warfare is a theme that runs through many First World War veteran accounts. This disconnect was one of the great tragedies of the First World War. The soldiers who fought in the trenches couldn't adequately communicate what they had experienced to the people at home. The people at home couldn't imagine what the trenches were actually like. And when the war ended, instead of a kind of national reckoning about what the trenches had meant, what the slaughter had accomplished, there was often just a kind of collective desire to move on and forget. Memorials were built, but they were abstract. Parades happened, but they were celebratory. There was little genuine processing of what had actually occurred. This is partly why the stories of individual soldiers are so important. When you read the letters and diaries of soldiers who actually lived in the trenches, when you hear their descriptions of what it was like, it becomes impossible to romanticize or abstract away from the reality of their experience. You're forced to confront the fact that these were human beings, just like us, who were forced to live in conditions that would drive most of us insane. And yet they survived. They found ways to keep going. They found humanity in an environment specifically designed to strip it away. The survival strategies that soldiers developed in the trenches tell us something profound about human resilience and adaptability. When faced with circumstances that seem impossible to bear, the human mind and body have an almost unlimited capacity to adapt, to find meaning, to create community, to maintain hope. This doesn't mean that the trenches were survivable in the sense of being a pleasant or acceptable environment. They weren't. The conditions were horrific and indefensible, but humans, when faced with these horrific conditions, found ways to survive psychologically and physically. They found ways to remain human, and that survival, that resistance to the dehumanizing forces of trench warfare, is perhaps the most important story from the First World War. The conversations that happened in trenches were unlike anything that happened in civilian life. Soldiers would huddle together in small groups, sharing cigarettes, sharing rations, sharing their most intimate fears and hopes. These weren't professional conversations. They were the conversations of men facing mortality, men who might not wake up the next morning, men who had to confront the reality that everything they had taken for granted in their previous lives might never happen again. Many soldiers wrote letters during their time in the trenches, letters to mothers, to wives, to sweethearts left behind in a world that now seemed impossibly distant. These letters were often censored, but in the ones that survived, you can see soldiers wrestling with the fundamental question of what their lives meant. A young man named Gerald Brennan wrote to his sister in 1916, and in his letter, he describes not the dramatic moments of battle, but the ordinary moments of trench life. He writes about the way the mud stuck to everything. He writes about the particular shade of grey that seemed to characterize every waking moment. He writes about standing watch on a cold night and wondering if this was what the rest of his life would be. What made the trenches survivable for many soldiers was the structure of rotation. The military understood that men couldn't be kept in the front-line trenches indefinitely. Extended exposure to trench conditions would destroy not just their bodies but their minds. So soldiers would rotate through 3 different lines. The front line was the most dangerous but the most intense. After a stint in the front line, soldiers would move back to the support trenches, where the danger was reduced but still present. Then they would move to the reserve trenches, where they could rest and recover. A typical rotation might last from 3 days to 2 weeks in the front line, depending on the situation. A longer period in support trenches, maybe a week or 2, and then, if they were lucky, time in the reserve trenches or even behind the lines entirely, where they could attempt to recover from the psychological and physical trauma of being in the front. Of course, being behind the lines didn't mean safety. Artillery bombardments didn't distinguish between front lines and rear areas. Soldiers could be killed by shells landing on rear positions just as easily as they could be killed in the front lines. But at least in the rear areas, they weren't standing face to face with the enemy. They weren't staring across no man's land at the trenches they would eventually have to assault. For soldiers on leave, getting away from the trenches was both a blessing and a curse. Leave was rare and precious. A soldier might get to go home for a week or 2 every several months. The journey itself was an ordeal, traveling from the front lines to the coast, then across the English Channel, then to home. But the real difficulty wasn't the physical journey, it was the psychological dissonance. Soldiers would arrive home to find their families celebrating their survival, wanting to know about the war, asking what it was like. And soldiers would try to explain. But how do you explain the trenches to someone who has never been there? How do you tell your mother about the smell of rotting bodies? How do you tell your sweetheart about the way your best friend was torn apart by machine gun fire? Many soldiers chose not to talk about it at all. They would spend their leave trying to act normal, trying to pretend that they were still the same person who had left home months or years earlier. But everyone could see that they weren't. They were changed, fundamentally changed by their experiences. Then came the time to return to the front. The journey back was a kind of descent into hell. Soldiers knew what they were returning to. They knew that the leave was over and now they had to go back to the trenches, to the death, to the horror. Many soldiers reported that the depression and anxiety about returning to the front was worse than the actual time spent in the trenches. At least in the trenches, you didn't have to anticipate the danger. You were living it. But on leave, knowing that you had to return, the anticipation was almost unbearable. There are accounts from soldiers who attempted to extend their leave by any means necessary. Some deliberately injured themselves. Some came down with sudden illnesses that didn't quite reach the level of needing hospitalization. Some simply went absent without leave, knowing that they would face severe punishment, up to and including execution, rather than return to the trenches. The military responded to this by tightening regulations, but the fundamental reality remained. No soldier wanted to go back to the trenches. The experience of leave also created a strange kind of survivor's guilt. Soldiers who were able to take leave while their comrades remained in the trenches would often feel guilty about their escape, however temporary. They would arrive back at the front to find that some of their comrades had been killed during the time they were away. They had been safe at home while their friends died. This created a psychological burden that many soldiers carried for the rest of their lives. One of the most underappreciated aspects of survival in the trenches was the role of humor. Soldiers developed an incredibly dark and cynical sense of humor that allowed them to process the horror around them. They would make jokes about their own deaths. They would create cartoons mocking the high command. They would sing songs with lyrics that would be considered shocking even by modern standards. This humor wasn't something that happened outside the trenches. It was happening inside them, as a daily survival mechanism. Trench newspapers were particularly fascinating artifacts of this humor. These were hand-drawn newspapers created by soldiers, circulated among the ranks, containing jokes, cartoons, commentary on trench life, and mockery of the generals. Some of these newspapers were quite sophisticated. They had multiple pages, illustrations, classified ads that were jokes about trench conditions. They had sports columns that talked about the game of warfare. They were brilliant examples of how soldiers used humor to process and critique their circumstances. One particularly famous trench newspaper from a British unit had a section called Military Wisdom that contained deliberately terrible military advice. Things like, never look before you leap over the trench parapet, as you might see the Germans. Or, always stand in the middle of no man's land to get a better view of the enemy positions. The humor was dark and it was cutting, but it served an important purpose. It allowed soldiers to critique the absurdity of their situation without being executed for insubordination. Officers were often the target of this humor, which must have been frustrating for the command structure. Soldiers would create cartoons depicting officers living in comfortable quarters far from the front, while enlisted men suffered in the trenches. There was truth in these cartoons, which made them more effective as a form of resistance. Officers generally did live farther back, in relative safety and comfort. They ate better food, they had better sleeping arrangements. The gap between the officer class and the enlisted men was one of the great sources of resentment in the trenches. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, the relationship between officers and men was incredibly complex. Officers who showed genuine concern for their soldiers' welfare and who led from the front rather than from the rear were deeply respected. There are accounts of soldiers following officers into certain death, because they trusted and respected those officers. But officers who were perceived as being distant or uncaring, who gave orders without understanding the consequences, were deeply despised. The phenomenon of trench raiding gave soldiers a way to channel their aggression and frustration into action. Raiding parties would be organized to go into no man's land and attack enemy trenches. These weren't large-scale attacks. They were relatively small operations involving anywhere from 10 to 100 soldiers. The goal was typically to capture prisoners, gather intelligence, or destroy enemy equipment. But the psychological purpose was perhaps more important than the tactical purpose. Raiding gave soldiers a sense of agency, a feeling that they were taking action rather than just waiting to be shelled. Raiding parties would prepare meticulously. They would study maps of the enemy positions. They would go out at night to scout the terrain. They would prepare weapons, often using specially sharpened tools or small bombs that were less likely to alert the entire enemy position. Then, at night, they would crawl out into no man's land, moving slowly through the darkness, aware that one mistake could result in their discovery and their deaths. Successful raids were celebrated as victories. The soldiers involved would be praised, sometimes even decorated. For a brief moment, they had done something that mattered. They had accomplished something concrete in a war that was otherwise characterized by endless stalemate and meaningless deaths. It's fascinating to think about how soldiers clung to these small victories, how they created narrative, meaning from tiny military actions that ultimately changed nothing about the larger situation on the Western Front. The artillery bombardments were perhaps the single most terrifying aspect of trench warfare. When artillery shells rained down on a trench, they didn't discriminate. They couldn't be fought against or resisted. You could only hide and hope that you weren't hit. The psychological impact of bombardments was devastating. Soldiers described the way the earth would shake, the way you couldn't hear anything except the explosions, the way everything seemed to become unreal, surreal, like you were experiencing it in a dream. Artillery bombardments could last for days or even weeks. The Somme offensive began with a week-long bombardment before the infantry assault. Over 1.5 million artillery shells were fired in that week. 1,500,000 explosions. The sound must have been literally incomprehensible. Soldiers who survived the bombardment were often partially deaf afterward, their eardrums damaged by the constant assault of explosive sound waves. Beyond the physical damage, bombardments caused what became known as bombardment shock or shell shock. Soldiers who survived intensive bombardments would be fundamentally changed by the experience. They would have difficulty sleeping. They would jump at loud noises. They would have panic attacks triggered by sudden sounds. Some soldiers would completely break down after a bombardment, becoming catatonic or incoherent. The military called this malingering or cowardice, but what was actually happening was a complete psychological collapse caused by extreme stress. The treatment for these conditions was often cruel. Soldiers who showed signs of shell shock were sometimes forced back into the trenches immediately. The theory was that if you didn't let them rest and recover, they would recover faster. This was, of course, completely wrong. Forcing traumatized soldiers back into the trenches only deepened their trauma. Some soldiers reacted by attempting suicide. Some simply went catatonic and couldn't be moved. The military's response was typically to execute soldiers who refused orders, which created a horrifying situation where traumatized men were being shot by firing squads, made up of their own comrades. The issue of fraternization across enemy lines was another interesting aspect of trench warfare. Despite being locked in a deadly conflict, soldiers on opposite sides of no man's land sometimes developed an unexpected rapport. On quiet nights, soldiers would shout insults at each other, but sometimes they would also shout conversations. They would call out warnings about planned artillery barrages. They would joke with each other. In some sectors, informal truces would develop where soldiers on both sides would agree not to shoot at each other during certain times of day. The most famous example of this was the Christmas Truce of 1914. On Christmas Day, soldiers on both the British and German lines put down their weapons and ventured into no man's land. They exchanged gifts. They sang carols together. They played football. For one day, in a small section of the Western Front, the war stopped. Soldiers who had been trying to kill each other just the day before were now standing beside each other in the snow, smoking cigarettes and talking about their families. When the High Command learned about the Christmas truce, they were furious. This kind of fraternization was considered the most serious breach of military discipline. Orders were issued ensuring that such truces would never happen again. Soldiers who had participated were transferred to different units. The military understood that if soldiers truly got to know their enemies as human beings, if they saw the other side as people rather than as abstract enemies, the entire system of trench warfare would break down. So they worked hard to prevent any kind of human connection across the lines. But the memory of the Christmas truce remained. For soldiers who had participated, it became proof that something different was possible. That the war, despite its horrific nature, wasn't inevitable. That human beings could choose cooperation over conflict even in the worst circumstances. This was perhaps one of the most subversive ideas that emerged from the trenches, because it challenged the narrative that the war was necessary, that it was right, that it was justified. The experience of being gassed was perhaps the most horrifying form of trench warfare. Gas was introduced to the Western Front in 1915, and it immediately became a weapon that soldiers feared even more than artillery shells. The first gas attacks were chlorine gas, which would drift across no man's land and into the enemy trenches. Soldiers who were exposed to chlorine gas would choke and die, their lungs filled with fluid as the gas essentially dissolved their respiratory system from the inside. The military eventually developed gas masks, but the early masks were crude and often ineffective. Soldiers would put them on when they detected gas, but sometimes the masks didn't seal properly, or the wearer didn't put it on quickly enough. Soldiers who were exposed to gas but survived would be badly damaged. Their lungs would be scarred. They would cough blood for weeks afterward. Many soldiers who survived gas exposure in the war died years later from respiratory diseases that had been triggered by the gas exposure. The fear of gas created a new kind of terror in the trenches. Soldiers would have lookouts watching for the telltale greenish clouds of gas drifting toward their positions. When gas was detected, alarm bells or gongs would be sounded, and everyone had to get their masks on immediately. The disruption this caused to sleep, to eating, to any kind of normal activity was constant. Soldiers might be awakened at 3 in the morning to an alarm that turned out to be a false alarm, or it could be real gas, and they might have minutes to get their masks on before being exposed to a poison that would destroy their lungs. As the war continued, gas evolved. After chlorine, there was phosgene gas, which was even more deadly. And then there was mustard gas, which didn't just destroy lungs but also caused severe chemical burns on any exposed skin. Soldiers who were exposed to mustard gas would have their skin literally burned off. Their eyes would be destroyed. Their respiratory system would be ravaged. Mustard gas was perhaps the most horrific weapon introduced during the First World War. The introduction of new weapons continued throughout the war. Tanks were introduced by the British in 1916, huge mechanical monsters that could cross trenches and crush everything in their path. Soldiers who had never seen tanks before were absolutely terrified by them. Early tanks were slow and unreliable, but they represented a new form of terror. Flamethrowers were introduced. Aircraft with machine guns appeared in the sky. Each new weapon meant new ways for soldiers to die, new horrors to process, new reasons to be afraid. And yet soldiers continued to survive. They adapted to each new weapon. They developed tactics to deal with tanks, to deal with gas, to deal with aircraft. The human capacity for adaptation is remarkable. No matter what horror was introduced, soldiers found ways to process it, understand it, and survive it. The question of discipline in the trenches was a constant challenge for the military. Soldiers were exhausted, traumatized, and increasingly questioning why they were fighting this war that seemed to have no end and no purpose. Morale was often terrible. Soldiers would develop what became known as trench fatigue or trench exhaustion, a condition where they simply couldn't function anymore. They couldn't fight, they couldn't think, they couldn't do anything but exist in a kind of zombie-like state. To maintain discipline, the military used a system of harsh punishments. Desertion, or even the attempt to desert, could result in execution. Disobedience of orders could result in execution. Sleeping while on guard duty could result in execution. The British Army executed over 300 soldiers during the First World War. Most of these executions were for military offences, like desertion or cowardice, and many of them were almost certainly individuals who were suffering from severe psychological trauma. These executions created a different kind of horror in the trenches. Soldiers would be forced to watch executions of their comrades. A soldier who had shown signs of shell shock, who had broken under the pressure of continuous bombardment, would be taken from the trenches and shot by firing squad. Then his body would be displayed as a warning to others. This was supposed to maintain discipline and prevent other soldiers from attempting to desert or refuse orders. What it actually did was deepen the trauma and increase the resentment toward the military leadership. By 1917, morale in the trenches was at an all-time low. Soldiers were questioning whether the war was worth fighting. Mutinies broke out in several armies. The French army actually experienced a significant mutiny where soldiers refused to attack. Sitting in their trenches and refusing orders, the mutiny was brutally suppressed, with dozens of soldiers being executed to restore order. The Russian army experienced even more severe problems with morale. By 1917, the Russian Revolution was beginning. Soldiers in the Russian trenches were increasingly sympathetic to revolutionary ideas. Officers and non-commissioned officers who pushed soldiers too hard would sometimes be killed by the soldiers themselves. The Russian front basically collapsed as soldiers abandoned their trenches and went home to participate in the revolution. This was probably the most dramatic example of how impossible trench warfare had become, how unsustainable the situation was. As the war dragged on into 1918, there was a sense that it couldn't possibly continue much longer. The situation was simply unsustainable. Soldiers couldn't take it anymore. The killing had to stop. The Spring Offensive of 1918 was Germany's last major attempt to break the stalemate. It failed, and after that failure, it became increasingly clear that the war would end soon. Germany sued for peace. The armistice was signed on November 11, 1918. The war was over, but the end of the war created its own set of problems. Millions of soldiers who had been in the trenches suddenly had to reintegrate into civilian society. They had been shaped by their experiences in ways that were fundamental and irreversible. Many of them were physically damaged, missing limbs or eyes or hearing or the ability to walk. Many of them were psychologically damaged in ways that weren't visible, but were no less debilitating. Civilian society had no idea how to deal with this influx of traumatized veterans. There were parades and celebrations, but there was also incomprehension and often hostility toward the veterans. People who had been safely at home during the war didn't understand what the soldiers had experienced. Some civilians actually resented the soldiers, blaming them for the war or for not having ended it sooner. The transition from soldier to civilian was traumatic in its own way. Soldiers who had been living with hundreds of other men suddenly found themselves isolated. Soldiers who had been making decisions about life and death suddenly found themselves doing mundane civilian jobs. Soldiers who had been in constant danger suddenly found themselves in safety, and some of them couldn't handle it. The absence of danger, the absence of the intensity and purpose that had characterized their lives in the trenches, left many veterans struggling with depression and purposelessness. Employment was another major issue. Soldiers were discharged from the military and expected to find jobs in a civilian economy that was recovering from war and often couldn't provide adequate employment for the millions of returning soldiers. Some soldiers ended up homeless. Some ended up in mental institutions, unable to cope with civilian life. Some turned to crime. Some turned to alcohol and drugs. The war didn't end when the armistice was signed. For many soldiers, it continued in a different form. The rate of suicide among First World War veterans was shockingly high. Men who had survived the trenches, who had made it through the horror and the slaughter, took their own lives years later, unable to deal with the psychological aftermath. The causes varied. Some soldiers couldn't handle the change to civilian life. Some couldn't find employment. Some were suffering from severe psychological trauma that manifested as depression or anxiety that made normal functioning impossible. There were soldiers who did successfully transition to civilian life, but even these individuals often carried the weight of their experiences for the rest of their lives. They would have nightmares. They would be triggered by loud noises or certain smells that reminded them of the trenches. They would struggle with relationships because they found it difficult to connect with people who hadn't experienced what they had experienced. One of the most remarkable aspects of the First World War was the literature that emerged from it. Soldiers who had been in the trenches became writers, poets, and artists. They created works that attempted to convey the experience of trench warfare to people who had never been there. These works are among the most important literary products of the 20th century. Wilfred Owen, a soldier who was killed just days before the armistice, wrote poetry that captured the horror of trench warfare with devastating clarity. His poem Dulce et decorum est describes soldiers in the trenches and the gas attack that kills one of them. The poem ends with a Latin phrase that gives it its title, which translates to "It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country." Owen adds his own commentary, saying that anyone who tells young men this is a lie, that it's not sweet or fitting to die in war. That war is horror and slaughter and waste. Robert Graves, who survived the war, wrote a memoir called Goodbye to All That, which is one of the most detailed and honest accounts of what life in the trenches was actually like. Graves doesn't glorify war. He doesn't make it seem noble or meaningful. He simply describes it as it was, with all its horror and absurdity and tragedy. Erich Maria Remarque, a German soldier, wrote All Quiet on the Western Front, which is perhaps the most powerful novel ever written about trench warfare. The novel follows a group of German soldiers through the war and shows how they are fundamentally changed and ultimately destroyed by their experiences. The book was so honest about the reality of war that it was banned in Nazi Germany, considered too defeatist and demoralizing. These works, and many others like them, served an important function. They preserved the truth about trench warfare at a time when there was pressure to forget or sanitize the reality of the war. They insisted that the war had been a tragedy, a waste, a horror that should never be repeated. They argued that the soldiers had been sent to die for nothing, that the military leadership had been incompetent, that the war had accomplished nothing worth the price that was paid. This perspective was controversial. Many people, particularly military leaders and government officials, wanted to maintain the narrative that the war had been necessary and right, but the voices of the soldiers themselves were powerful and couldn't be completely suppressed. The books and poetry and art created by First World War veterans formed a kind of counter-narrative to the official version of events. The medical establishment gradually came to understand that shell shock was a real condition, though they were slow to recognize it as what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Hospitals were set up to treat veterans with psychological problems. Some of these hospitals were genuinely helpful. Others were horrific places where traumatized men were subjected to cruel treatments in the name of curing them. The development of psychiatric care and psychology as a field was actually significantly advanced by the need to treat First World War veterans. Psychiatrists had to develop new ways of thinking about psychological trauma. They had to develop treatments that actually worked. The work that was done in these early psychiatric hospitals formed the foundation for modern understanding of trauma and its treatment. By the 1920s and 1930s, there was a kind of narrative that emerged from the First World War. The war had been a mistake. It had been fought for no good reason. Millions had died for nothing. This narrative was powerful and influenced public opinion throughout the interwar period. It contributed to the reluctance of democratic countries to rearm in the face of the rising threat of Nazi Germany. In some ways, the honesty about the First World War's futility and horror contributed to the conditions that allowed the Second World War to happen. But from the perspective of the soldiers themselves, the honesty was essential. They had survived something almost incomprehensible. They had lived through horror that defies description, and they felt a responsibility to make sure that the world understood what had happened, that the true nature of their experience was preserved in the historical record. The trenches changed warfare forever. Military thinkers studied the First World War intensely, trying to figure out what had gone wrong, how to prevent the stalemate that had characterized the conflict from happening again. The Second World War saw the development of new tactics, new strategies, new weapons. But the memory of the First World War, of the trenches, haunted military planners for decades. The survival strategies that soldiers developed in the trenches tell us something profound about human resilience. When faced with circumstances that seem impossible to bear, humans can find ways to continue, to adapt, to maintain their humanity even in the most dehumanizing circumstances. The soldiers who survived the trenches proved that the human spirit can endure things that should be unendurable. Today, over a century after the First World War ended, the trenches are silent. The battlefields have been reclaimed by nature. Forests have grown over areas that were once blasted wastelands, but the trenches still exist in some places, preserved as historical monuments and reminders of what happened there. Walking through a trench in 2024 is a visceral experience. You can feel the narrowness of the space. You can imagine what it would have been like to spend months in this place, with thousands of other men, under constant threat of death. The veterans of the First World War are all gone now. The last surviving soldier from the First World War died in 2012. There are no more people who can tell us firsthand what it was like to live in the trenches. We have only their letters, their diaries, their books, their art. And these documents are precious because they preserve the truth about what happened. They remind us that war is not glorious, that the cost is not abstract but deeply personal and devastating. The trenches of the First World War were places where ordinary young men were transformed by extraordinary circumstances, where they discovered reserves of courage and resilience they didn't know they had, where they formed bonds with their comrades that were deeper than most human relationships, where they survived, day after day, month after month, despite conditions that should have been unsurvivable. Their survival was a testament to human adaptability, to the power of community and friendship, to the determination to stay alive even when death seems inevitable. And their stories, the stories of the trenches, deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be told and retold and studied, because in understanding how soldiers survived the trenches, we understand something fundamental about human nature. We understand that we are capable of surviving things we never thought we could survive, that we can find meaning and purpose, even in the darkest circumstances, that our connections with other people can sustain us through ordeals that seem impossible to bear. The trenches are gone now, but the lessons they teach us remain. The lesson that war is horror, The lesson that ordinary people can survive extraordinary circumstances. The lesson that the human spirit is more resilient than we ever imagine. These lessons, preserved in the stories and testimonies of the soldiers who lived through them, continue to matter. They will continue to matter as long as there are people willing to listen and learn from history.